In many corners of the Genshin community, there's an almost unspoken assumption that everyone ends up having a favorite character, and that people serious about their favorite will take them to C6. Early on, even before I met her in-game, I had decided that Raiden would be the one I take that far. More than 2 years later, after 3 reruns, my Raiden is not C6, and she never will be. For a long time, Raiden Shogun was the one who got away. I started during her debut banner, and while Aloy's release was the push I needed to finally download the game and try it out, I was smitten by Raiden's design from day one. I had barely set foot in Mondstadt and was still trying to understand the avalanche of features the game was introducing with customary word salad instructions, so I wouldn't actually meet her until weeks later. Since it was her debut, however, every time I looked up or just saw anything related to the game, people were talking about her playstyle or posting fan art or debating whether she was worth pulling for. It was all a bit overwhelming. Something about her appearance really spoke to me though. I love her hairstyle, her outfit is gorgeous, and she seemed equal parts intimidating and beautiful. Knowing nothing about her personality, her design alone convinced me that she would be a favorite. I hadn't ever played a gacha game before, and since I was focused more on learning and enjoying the other parts of the game, I didn't really get a solid understanding of the wishing system until towards the end of the banner. Sadly, this meant I only had enough time to gather primo gems for a couple of temples before it ended. I got Kuchisara, but the shooting stars did not turn gold. Disappointed, I resolved to do everything in my power to get her the next time around. In the 6 months between Raiden's first banner and her second, I completed the vast majority of the content in the game, and while I pulled a bunch of characters, I made sure to keep some primo gems saved so I would be prepared, even though her personality in the quest was not quite what I had hoped. The Archon quests in Mondstadt and Liyue had left me mostly uninterested, and it was the gameplay and the beautiful world which kept me hooked. In Inazuma that changed a fair bit, but not entirely for the better. This chapter of the story managed to grab my interest a little more than the previous ones, though I think a large part of that was the contrast between the more welcoming mainland and the harsh and hostile islands, backed by the often mournful music. However, while I appreciated the broad strokes, it felt to me like a good story somewhat badly told, and a key casualty of that was Raiden's characterization. We spent the first section seeing with our own eyes how her actions actively harmed the people of Inazuma. When we eventually met her, she was incredibly unempathetic. She's aware of all the terrible things she had set into motion, and just did not care about the harm she had caused. In the main Archon quest, the resolution to this felt surface level at best, and didn't resolve her arc for me. She never showed remorse or took accountability for what she had done. While I can enjoy an anti-hero when done right, it did not feel like this was their intent in Raiden's case. Her first story quest is available straight after the Archon quest finishes and felt quite jarring. It shows her and the traveler taking a relaxing stroll through the city, drinking dango milk and talking about light novels. It's an important character moment for her, as she learns that change is not always bad, but due to its tone, it felt badly timed and didn't provide closure. Her second story quest does explore those aspects of her story and provides a much better resolution to her arc, but that was only released alongside her rerun, so I didn't have that context yet when her banner came, and was ambivalent about her story up to that point. I still loved her design though, and fully intended to make her my main, in spite of that slight disappointment in her characterization. I absolutely loved her gameplay. Her normal attacks aren't anything special, though her animations are suitably elegant, particularly the sweeping arc of her charged attack. Her skill is extremely useful. It causes a small amount of electro damage when cast, but the real value is the buff it grants to your team, which provides 3 main benefits. First, character's burst damage is increased. Second, when you deal damage to opponents, you trigger a coordinated electro attack on the enemy. And third, when these coordinated attacks hit an enemy, they generate energy particles. This alone means Raiden is fantastic in a vast variety of teams. Many DPS characters focus on their burst, so the burst damage buff is valuable. The coordinated attacks are perfect for reactions, especially because they can hit enemies regardless of range. And finally, the energy generation means that she's possibly the best battery in the game, a role which is badly underrated. Her burst is also great. It kicks off with a gigantic flash of electro damage, then she draws her alternate weapon, an electro electro-infused sword, and for a period of time her normal attacks become extremely powerful. During this time, she generates even more energy for herself and the rest of the party. Also, when you use other characters' burst before using Raiden's, her own burst damage is increased, so she has fantastic synergy with energy-hungry characters. She fits in a variety of roles, from hyper carry to sub DPS to support, and I've always found her to be extremely fun to play. On her release, there were a lot of people who were disappointed in her, but over time they have been proven emphatically wrong. She does have some caveats which are valid complaints. For example, she doesn't work with Beidou or Yunjin at all, but overall they are minor issues. So I was definitely going to pull for her. That was never in doubt. The question, in my mind, was a little different. How many constellations should I get? My long-term goal was to C6 her, but her rerun came just after a long run of banners for characters I had really wanted. She was also on a joint banner with Kokomi's first rerun, another character I had been waiting for with little patience. On top of all that, I badly wanted Raiden's signature spear as well, so unfortunately her constellations would have to wait. Luck was with me and I managed to get Kokomi, Raiden and Engulfing Lightning. I didn't have enough save to continue wishing, so I decided to leave it there for the time being and wish for more once her banner returned again. And then came the pain of building her. I farmed her signature emblem artifact set for a month after month after month and grew to really hate that domain. She would be fine with a 2-piece set combination providing ER, attack or electro damage bonus. The main goal is to aim for around 250 ER with attack as the second priority stat plus the usual crit stats, but the 4-piece emblem set just works so well with her kit. Raiden's build requirements are a little different to a typical DPS character. Her kit is very much designed around energy recharge. She has a passive which converts ER into electro damage bonus, so depending on your artifacts, an ER sense can be more valuable to her than an attack one. High ER also increases her ability to battery herself and others. Her signature weapon also converts ER into attack, which makes it even more valuable, to the point where an ER sense is noticeably better than an attack one. With an ER sense equipped, her electro damage bonus becomes even more powerful, meaning she can potentially use an attack goblet instead of an electro one. If you don't have her weapon, then for a typical build, you'd use any 5-star spear or a crit spear if you happen to have one, or get fishing to get the catch since it's a fabulous free-to-play option. After a whole lot of blood, sweat and tears, I managed to put together a 4-piece set which I was happy with. Thanks to her spear, I ended up with an ER Sans, an attack goblet, and a crit rate circlet. When at rest, she has around 1800 attack, 65 to 152 crit, and a whopping 269 ER, plus a grand total of 0 electro damage bonus. When the buffs from her passive and her spear are active, however, her attack jumps to almost 2300 and she gains a 68% electro damage bonus. While these numbers can feel a little lower than might be achievable with many other DPS characters, this is a very capable build for Raiden. She benefits from such a variety of stats that they seem more diluted at first glance, but she's incredibly strong regardless. She absolutely lived up to my expectations, and I quickly had several fantastic teams built around her. She was versatile and useful even before Dendro was released, since energy is such an important part of many great teams. I tried a ton of different options, but my favorite is probably Raiden, Xiangling, Bennett and Sucrose, which has been one of my main Abyss teams since the moment my Raiden was built. This is quite similar to the ever-popular Raiden National team, nicknamed Rational, but with Sucrose instead of Xingqiu. It sacrifices the vaporized damage you'd get due to Xingqiu's Hydro application, and instead Sucrose provides crowd control, an EM buff, and VV Shred. I favored this team at first just because I didn't have my Xingqiu build, but then by the time I did, the team just felt so comfortable I never felt any need to try replacing it. Since her skills, buff, and coordinated attacks last for so long, a massive 25-second duration with a mere 10-second cooldown, she's incredibly flexible as a support and will fit into almost any team where you want a battery or an electro applier. Aside from being a fantastic support, she's also a powerful DPS and hypercarry when built and supported right. If you happen to have Kujosara, and especially if you're lucky enough to have her at C6, you can set up Raiden's burst to be a gigantic nuke, capable of some of the highest non-reaction damage numbers in the game. Since the release of Dendro, she's also a great option in even more teams. Her coordinated attacks are effective Hyper Bloom triggers, so people often give her a full EM build to make for a completely different approach. And of course, she's great for quicken teams as well. In my case, I still play her as an Electro DPS and battery, since I generally prefer Kuki for Hyper Bloom and would not want to dismantle my current build in order to build Raiden for EM. Perhaps someday when artifact loadouts exist. Eventually, Raiden's banner came around again, and I had been saving up some more in anticipation. I wasn't expecting to get too far towards C6. My plan was to get 1 or 2 constellations each time she had a rerun, depending on the size of my Primo Gem stash, and slowly work towards her C6 rather than getting them all at once. I got her to C2. Raiden's C1 increases her ability to gain power from other characters' bursts. It makes her chakra buff charge up faster, which results in more damage from Raiden's own burst. Her C2, however, is a bit ridiculous. During her burst, Raiden's attacks completely ignore 60% of the opponent's defense stat. She's powerful enough at C0, but this constellation just makes her unstoppable. And that's why my mind started to change. Having a well-built C2 R1 Raiden made even the hardest content in the game feel noticeably less challenging, or even easy when the enemies happened to suit her teams. And mind you, by this time I had already consistently 36-starred the Abyss every rotation for almost a year. Every now and then I looked at Raiden's higher constellations and I tried to picture how powerful she would be if I really did take her to C6. Her most valuable constellations are her first 3, but of course they all do make a difference, and even her C3 alone made me feel concerned. You see, I like at least a little bit of challenge in Genshin. I don't like turning up to a fight and having the enemies die while I'm still setting up my buffs before I can even switch to my DPS character. I actually miss the days when I couldn't just steamroll past anything in the overworld, when Ruin Guards felt intimidating, or when Dragon Spine was a terrifying ordeal. If we could set the overworld enemies to match the Abyss's difficulty, I would do so in a heartbeat. And I know, I could just strip my characters bare of equipment and reduce their power, but considering that a huge part of the enjoyment of acquiring characters for me is building them right to get the most out of them with what I have available, this would not have the same effect at all. With that in mind, playing with her after getting that C2 was the final wake-up call. I realized that actually, getting constellations doesn't bring me happiness, and if anything, it would just make one of the biggest flaws in the game for me even more noticeable. I realized I'd been swept up by the gacha culture where we simp for our favorite characters, and we show our love by spending money and effort to perfect and complete them. I'm like 90% sure this trend was started by the people who profit from it the most. When the issue with much of Genshin's combat is that it's too easy, spending your hard-saved primos, or even swiping your credit card, to make combat even easier seems like such a self-defeating choice to make. That said, I'm firmly of the opinion that people should do what makes them happy, regardless of what anyone else thinks or prefers, so this is by no means a not-so-subtle call-out towards C6 character havers. If having that favorite at max constellation brings the most joy, then by all means, this is the way. But it's always good to be aware of the subtle peer pressure influencing your choices. I have decided that in the end, that is not the path for me. My Raiden will remain at C2, and I'll happily spend my hard-earned primos elsewhere on characters who bring some new variety to the game, instead of more strength to someone already so powerful. And the same goes for other characters. The higher constellations are consistently a bit over the top these days, and while I understand the appeal of being able to clear the Abyss in a few seconds, it doesn't really interest me. My favorite constellations are quality of life ones such as Shenhe and Baizu's C1, both of which add an extra charge to their skill and thus make rotations freer and more comfortable. Raiden remains one of my favorite characters to play and easily one of my most powerful, and I'm glad to have her. If you're thinking about pulling for her, she's well worth it. If you're planning to pull for her constellations, maybe think about it a little more carefully. Will making the game easier actually make you enjoy it more? For some people, that's a resounding yes. For others, not so much. Neither choice is more valid than the other. Until next time!